Thanks, Liz. Okay, I'd like to make this fairly interactive, but we do need to almost just give a little bit of information to start. Mike and I have had conversations about what we talk about and how we do it. And there's a kind of reason why I'm standing up here. So I've been a member at the Gliding Club for 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was a hang glider pilot. And I also flew paragliders in the days when you could, before people had to get certified. And I had 30 years of flying, and I was based here. So I'm very familiar with the local area. And I've recognised a few faces here as well. So for me, this actually is quite a good opportunity, I think, because often these kind of rubbing up against each other is just due to lack of knowledge and lack of sharing and information. I think we can make a big difference today. I'm not the most experienced glider pilot, but I do understand the mindset, if you like, of the different groups. So what I wanted to do to start with was just to talk through the setup of the operation that we've got here at the Gliding Club and show you a couple of things that might work, just help you understand a little bit more. So this is our only site. We don't choose where the wind goes. Everything happens here. And the only real conflict or conversations that we have is where we've got a west, northwest through to west-southwest, where you might be flying Bradwell edge. The rest of it, you might transit through the airspace here, or you might transit past using a little bit of the ridges, although they don't work that well to the south. But most of the challenge comes in northwest through west-southwest direction. And I could put a few bullet points on here just to get in your head the kind of things that to look out for. You'll be well aware of windsock up and windsock down. We're flying when the windsock's up. We're not flying when the windsock's down. There is definitely a period, if you like, before we fly and a period after we fly where there isn't really much of a conflict. We can see what you guys are doing very clearly. The challenge comes when we get into the training mode, because all of our training happens here. And therefore, we often have very inexperienced pilots who are quite nervous about what they're doing, positioning themselves up for landing on an unusually shaped airfield compared to a lot of the airfields that you get elsewhere. And the challenge, and I'll keep coming back to this, most flights end up landing back here. Not landing here actually has a significant consequence. That's quite hard. It's, you guys have got a much easier job of landing. All my flights from here landed in random fields all over the place. Actually doing that in the glider is a difficult thing. Getting it out the field, the weight of it, putting trailers in, having somebody else drive a car to get it to the field, and so on. So I'll come back to that thing. Most days during the summer, we really don't start launching until 10:30. Occasionally on a really good day, we might start early. On a not very good day, we might start a bit later, and we'll be finished by 6. Part of the reason for that is, especially in a west wind, you get the low sun, and it's actually quite hard looking through a lightly scratched canopy to see what's going on. And we have what we call a Tufty Club on Thursday evenings. So the one time that we do fly through to dusk is on Thursdays. So again, it's just useful to have it in your mind and be aware that's happening in the summer. Okay. And the other thing I had on there was we're very safety conscious. It's part of the history of this club. It has a very safety mindset. Okay. When do we fly? Well, we pretty much fly in all wind directions and most wind strengths unless it's going bonkers. So up to 35 mile an hour or 30 knots, which is pretty strong, especially when it's coming over the hills here. You can get a lot of turbulence. The guys were flying today and it was gusting 30 at times. And they noticed that in some of the significant lift and sink. I'll see if I managed to get up to over 7,000 feet in wave today. But at the same time, we saw a couple of people coming into land that we heard about heavy sink as they were doing final turns. So you get the ups and the downs, but you can fly in significant wind. Gliders are heavy in comparison terms. So the lightweight wooden ones will be 200 kilos, and you add a pilot. The heavy ones, when you put 2 pilots in and an engine and fuel, can be up to 800 kilograms. So they're pretty heavy beasts, and they glide at some speed in those conditions as well. Here we've got a mix of club and private gliders. We've got 4 two-seaters and about 30 single-seaters, and the performance range is quite significant. So we've got training two-seaters, wooden single-seaters, and fiberglass single-seaters. I'll put this up on the various websites so you can have a look at this at your own time. But the key, I guess, is stall speed is in the mid to low 30 knots. LD varies from sort of mid-20s up to 50 plus to 1 on glide. Sync rate, 100 foot per minute to 150 foot per minute. But if you're in a thermal and you're doing a bigger circle, you're not actually right in the core in the way that you can be in a paraglider or a hang glider. And then the max speed, you can do crazy speeds. Well, I'm not used to, I wasn't used to this, and I'm still not used to flying around at some of the speeds that you can. But you can do on some of the single seat machines up to 175 mile an hour if you're really going for it. Obviously, you're going down quite fast, but it means you've got very good penetration, which is why we can fly in stronger winds. Coming back to the theme that I touched on the first one, the biggest driver for most pilots is the fear of not landing back at the airfield. Give you guys a bit of view of what's going on. Bear with me. That's better. And I'll keep touching on that because that is a big motivator for some of the behaviours that you might see. There isn't a kind of, oh, it's okay, I'll go and land somewhere. People will try and position themselves to get back here if they can. Okay, airfield. So this is our home base. And the dotted lines are the winch cable directions. So in a westerly, we've got one that runs pretty much east-west. We've got north-south and south-north, and we've also got one that runs in a southwesterly direction because we can have strong southwesterlies and it gets quite rotary close to the edge. So west you can't really launch, and that direction it doesn't work either because it's too much of a crosswind and strong winds. So really, those are the directions that we tend to run in. And from a hang glider and paraglider point of view, most of the time when it's either west or northwest, the Bradwell direction, we'll be either launching to the west, but we tend to do that when it's quite breezy, 15 knots or more, because we want it to be soarable when we launch it. We don't get very high with that short run. Most of the time we'll be launching up this way. So gliders here, winch up there, and launching towards where you guys are operating. And that is certainly where we're likely to get sort of the most meetings, and we need to think about that. So we have a limit that we run to, which is not below 1,800 feet over the airfield. The reason is on a decent breeze, you can get 1,800 feet on the winch going in this direction. So we have that limit. Don't go below 1,800 feet on the airfield. And we also avoid upwind of the launch point for a short period. And I'll explain that later. We have a launch bus. So if I take this direction to the north, we have a launch bus that sits here, we have a winch that sits there, and we have a tow-out vehicle that just pulls the cables. All of them have flashing lights on top, which work 90% of the time. And there's various other things that go on. But you can see if there's a bunch of gliders here, and there's yellow lights flashing, then there's probably launching going on because we're trying to get the guys off this end and up and flying. Okay. Takeoff sequences, the launch marshal. So it's very much a team sport in gliding. You have a launch marshal, you have a winchy, you have a retrieve driver, as well as an instructor and a pilot. So you can't fly solo. So there's I feel like a cultural difference that I noticed when I came and joined here. You know, it's like, right, Mike, you need to get involved in clerking, logging all the flights. You need to get involved in winching. You need to get involved in instructing and so on. So there's a lot to do launch marshalling as well. Make sure it's clear, take up slack, all out, the glider will climb. And on a good day, if it's really working well, we can launch a glider every 2 minutes. So we do them in banks of 4. We've got 2 winches with 2 cables each. Tow out the 4 cables, launch all 4, and then do it again. It's rare that we do it at that speed, but that is a possibility. Let me just show you a little video. So this is launching to the west, which, as I say, we tend to do in stronger winds. Here we go. And I'll just talk you through the process. So this is an all-out signal, which you might be familiar with. Launching to the west, so there's the clubhouse. There's a dip here, so you naturally launch, then rotate to the climb angle. And you can imagine you can't see much in front of you. And then as you go over the top, you can see the west edge here. Ping off. And at that point, you can then turn and start to look up the ridge. And here's the gully. Hang gliding, paragliding takeoff. So that just gives you a flavour, but I'll come back to talk about some of that because that is important to be aware of, what we can and can't see. Okay. Get my mouse back. Okay, now, quick shot of the airfield. So, this is the airfield, which you'll be familiar with. Our training process involves, on a westerly wind, and I'm really talking about that because that's where most of all will be interacting with each other. In a westerly wind, we come down the back wall. Now, there's a very good reason for that, because when I came, I had a conversation that said, well, hang on a minute, on the days when hang gliders and paragliders are flying, can we not come in this way? But actually, in the clough here, it's quite turbulent and sinky. So if you come in at the wrong height, very quickly you can lose any room for manoeuvre you have. This is very narrow across here. So landing across here, a glider has a lot of momentum with, a few hundred kilos. Stopping it in that distance is very hard. You've got to be pinpoint accurate. And here, where the clubhouse is, there's a lot of trees and buildings. So again, if you decide that you have to cut your turn short, you're actually coming in close to trees and buildings, which is not a good idea. So think training again. This is a really useful mechanism here. You run along the back wall, and if you're low, you turn in and land here. If you're high, you extend out and land across this way. So it's actually a very good way of training people how to vary their circuit to land in the right place. The consequence of that is that we end up coming in through what's known as Dead Man's Clough, and you guys I think call the gully, but that's the challenge, is that there's a potential area of conflict here. And it's again working out how we can come up with a mechanism to make that work. And the landing speeds, you'll be doing 50 to 65 knots as you're coming through here. So with 10 knots of tailwind, you're doing 60 to 75 knots across the ground, which is quite quick. So I've got a little video to show you this landing circuit. Again, it helps just to visualize it. So let me pull this other one up. And I'll talk you through it. Okay, so we can see the ridge here. This is the approach from high. So if you've been going cross country from outside, well outside the if you like, the airfield boundary, almost over the road, coming in and looking for 55 to 60 knots, checking the airfield, seeing what there is there. Just spin this on a little bit. And you can see here that the approach line, here's the gully, the approach line is through the gully to go down that back wall. Just speed it up and go. So going down the back wall and then turning into wind. You can see that we're quite a long way back. This day was about 12 knots westerly. And then using the air brakes here to actually vary the glide slope as we come into land. And actually, on a normal airfield, a lot of glider pilots look at this and go, how can you land in that short distance across here? They view that as quite short. But for us, because it's upslope, you actually lose a lot of momentum very quickly going upslope. Let's stop it, let it run. And again, doing 55 knots coming in here until we get down to ground level and then rounding out. Still down in one piece. Every time I watch it, still a good landing. Okay, and you can see the run out, even though we're going uphill, there's a decent run out. So that's just, again, just gives you an impression of how this works in here. Let's just come back. So, what we've done is this circuit. So what you saw there was this circuit. So starting out here, this tends to be, as I say, coming back from across country. You've seen that. That was what we showed on the video. There are a number of variations on that. And again, if there's activity on the paragliding, hang gliding side, we will try and limit what we do up here. We'll try and do that circuit because it limits the amount of time that we spend where you're flying. But quite often, if you're lower, or if there's congestion on the airfield, quite often, you'll know this, it just dies sometimes. What do you do when it dies? Everybody lands at the same time. So trying to work out that sequence of who's landing where and when, sometimes you might extend just for a little bit of time before you come back in. Sometimes you might have a bit of height. As ever, you really don't want to turn downwind close to the hill. That's not a good idea. So the thinking is you need to turn out before coming down the back wall and landing as normal. And the other one, which I think this is key, I want to be able to land back at Camphill. Sometimes if we're coming back into the airfield low and there isn't much lift on the ridge, we can go over what we call the bungee gate. So there's a little wood here, and just above the wood there's a gap in the wall. And actually it's actually got a fence in it, so it isn't a gap we can fly through. But that's an aiming point, and we land crosswind on the airfield here. So that's something, if you see somebody coming along here quite low, they're probably holding their breath because they don't want to end up landing down the bottom, and they're just looking to come straight in and then get down on the airfield as soon as they can. Okay, a little graphic. So looking at it in profile, we've got the winch here, we've got the launch bus there, and we've got our Boeing 757 going up on the launch. But the point here really is, at the initial launch, you've got a good view, and your launch marshal has said, all clear above and behind. But as soon as you rotate, which is within 5 seconds of the launch point, you have no visibility of what's going on ahead of you. And this period, so it might take a minute to go up the launch, just need to be aware that the pilot in that glider hasn't seen anything ahead of him or her, gets to the top, pings off, and because of the visibility on a glider, can't see what's here. So, and I know this from my days, I was like, well, I'm upwind of the wind, so I'm okay. I can find a thermal and climb, because I used to do that, guilty. But actually, it's quite a dangerous spot, because if you've moved into that zone whilst they're climbing, they haven't got any visibility of who is there and doing what. So just be, and it happens quite quickly on a glider. You know, the gliding speed generally is about 50 to 60 knots. So people can move around the air quite quickly. So be aware that that is an area where on the launching sequence, you quite often will find that pilots don't have a view of it. And I've got a little video just to show that. I hope. This one here. Okay, so we're on the launch point. Here's the clubhouse. So we're launching to the north. So this is the potential conflict I talked about. On a sort of light to moderate westerly, we might well be using this launch direction to get as much height as possible, and we wouldn't be launching to the west. Here's the parachute on the cable being pulled away. So this is take up slack. Hand ready to release if there's a problem. If the wing goes down, you need to release, otherwise you end up cartwheeling. Here we go, and we're up. So there's a rotation. You can see straight away there's no visibility ahead of you. So this launch also is got a right wing down slightly, so there's a little bit of easterly wind. And we do that to make sure the launch cable goes straight up. Otherwise, it gets blown over the side of the airfield. So we never go straight. We only go straight if the wind's straight on. So still no visibility ahead, coming to the top of the launch, and it levels off. Pull the cable. We've got 1,100 feet on that one. Turn to the left, and you can see all of that time, whatever's been going on beneath, around the clough, or around the gully rather, and around paragliding, hang gliding launch, there's no visibility. Now you can see. So at the point at which you've turned to the left and gone out over the ridge, then you can get a good view. But it just illustrates the different visibility you get from different machines. Okay, let's turn that one back and move that forward one. Okay. This is taken from a book that one of the gliding gurus, a chap called G. Dale, has created. So I just took his numbers rather than trying to work it out myself. It was far too complex. Depending on the angle of bank, and as you know, stronger thermals, you'll think of it more tightly. So logically, the sink rate of a glider, the sailplane, is better than a paraglider, for instance. But you can't stay in the core. So, and my experience is actually it sort of evens out. If the paraglider's got a really nice core and is right in the middle of it, it'll climb really fast and that's it, you'll go through the middle. But quite often it doesn't happen that way. You end up climbing at fairly similar rates. I flew with Gordon last year, Gordon Rigg, and I'd taken my radio with me, so I was chatting to him, and he was trying every trick in the book to outclimb me, and he came to the conclusion he needed a smaller, stronger core. And that kind of, to me, that kind of showcases the point that there's a perception about, and actually 90% is down to the pilot. The gliders, because of the circling range and the strength of thermal they can stay in, it tends to boil down to how good the pilot is that makes a difference. But here we've got, so 20 degrees of bank is 1,000 feet diameter on a glider, 30 degrees is 645 degrees of bank. So we aim for 45 degrees of bank in a decent thermal. That's the way the gliders are designed to climb at 45 degrees of bank. So you'll get a 500-foot diameter circle circumference when you're climbing in those conditions. And I guess it's all fairly standard stuff. So join the same turn direction. With sailplanes, because the visibility is really good up, the tendency is to think I'm climbing and to look up. So my encouragement would be for sailplanes to also look down, because you might well get a paraglider in a stronger thermal or in the core of the thermal climbing up to meet you. So that would be my encouragement that way. And I would say for paragliders also look up, because you might find that there's something up there which is behind the canopy, which is a glider who hasn't seen you. So it's one of those both ways. I think we need to make sure that we have a proper look out in all directions. Don't assume that someone else has seen you. We've got numerous examples of where people have thought they've seen everybody, and actually, have you seen everyone? Because a climb attracts gliders of all types. See somebody circling, it's just a magnet. Everybody's going to go in there. And, there is somebody you haven't seen is always a very good thought process just to keep running. That's it. That is the end of my piece. So I think I'll pause for a minute and say, have you got any questions whilst it's fresh in your mind? Or anything else that people want to emphasise that maybe I haven't talked about?
Mike, launch failures on the cable.
Yes, that's a good one.
Just cover that.
Yes, so in days gone by, we had cables that were quite fragile. We've got Dyneema now, which is incredibly strong, and I guess very dangerous if you actually wrap yourself around it. But cables do occasionally fail. So part of the training process is training for cable failures. Sometimes, so training for it generally isn't the problem because we know where they're going to drop. But sometimes, in certain wind directions, if you're flying in if you get a break, that cable can go outside the boundary of the airfield. Now, the winch drivers are trained to try and stop that happening. But and it's fine on normal operation, but sometimes you do get cables drifting away. So that's one of the things that, and we have trouble as winch drivers actually seeing the cable because it's so thin. We used to watch the curvature would tell you the tension. So you could say, well, I know that it's a heavy glider, so I need less curvature when I'm towing someone up. It's actually harder to do now because we've got Dyneema, and it's really difficult to see that. But it also means that it's harder if we have a cable break, you won't be able to see where the cable's gone. So that's another reason why you should try and stay away from the airfield boundaries, because you really don't want to be caught out by a flailing piece of cable. Chris?
Yeah, just something else that occurred to me is that when you're launching north and south, and that can be in quite a strong westerly in terms of, being right at the top end of paragliders. Paragliders may not be able to even fly and will still be launching north and south.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when that's happening, when you're in a two-seater, the structure in the back, this visibility is even less.
Yes.
In the front.
Yes. That's a very good point. So the guy who's actually doing lookout may not be the guy who knows how to look out very well. Yeah.
I think that thing about the changing the winch cable, I remember you used to be able to look if you were flying at a reasonable altitude, you could see the winch cables, whether they were laid out or not.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible now.
They're not visible.
What about the circuit pattern of the sailplane on the cable failure halfway up to?
Yes, that's a good one. So the rule is land ahead if you can. And certainly some of the gliders, you can stand them on the nose and pull the air brakes out, and that limits the speed, and they can go down very, very quickly. If you can't make it in ahead, then you do a shortened circuit, and that circuit will generally be over the lower lying land to the east. Yeah, so we tend not to fly out low over the edge. In an easterly wind, it's heavy sink. In a westerly wind, you don't know what other traffic and other things are going on, and it's away from the traffic. But if you do get a cable break, you'll actually see the glider will very suddenly go nose down. Wait till it's picked up proper flying speed, and then choose, do I land straight ahead or do I do a shortened circuit? Again, it'll be quite close to the boundaries. I guess the risk is if you're flying on the west edge, you really don't want to have a glider sort of doing a shortened circuit close to where you are. But usually the circuit is to the east. Richard?
Only just one, just on top of that, is that obviously in a westerly cable break, we do actually, one of our escape mechanisms is to actually go for the edge.
Yes.
So we'll be coming over that, the very edge is around about 70 knots.
Around about where the old wind machine used to be.
Yes.
Yeah. So that actually having moved windy a little bit closer is quite good, because it means that you can then zoom over the edge. And actually I have seen a couple of people who've had breaks go over the edge very low at speed, because you don't want to be in you're going through the rotor, so you need to be as fast as possible.
So when you say low, exactly how low?
Well, 10 foot off the ground.
Exactly. So it's low.
Yeah.
The other thing, Mike, is the ironmongery that drops off a cable break.
Yes.
There's parachute, length of cable.
That's a good
safety
point.
rope.
That's a good point. So if the cable breaks, you've got a load of cable which is attached to the winch, and you've actually got the parachute and the connectors still attached to the glider. And the instruction is, as soon as that happens, you should release that. Some people wait until they're over the airfield so that we don't lose the bits and pieces, the cabling and all the other stuff. Generally, it'll break. There's a weak link which is close to the glider, between the parachute and the glider. So what tends to happen if you get a weak link break is that the parachute will actually bring the cable down, and you'll have a lump of ironmongery, as you say, which is stuck to the glider, and you'll try and be over the airfield to release that. The less experienced pilots will release it straight away. One or two more experienced people might actually maneuver around with it. So there's no guarantee when that's going to come. And some people forget. So it's such a shock having that cable break that they continue flying and they land with that attached. And the danger is that you really don't know how much is attached underneath. So just keep your eyes open. It's one of those, be aware.
How often does it happen? Cable break?
I've been here on days when we've had 3 cable breaks. Sometimes it's the individual who fly, the style of flying of a pilot. If they pull back on the stick, then it can overstress the weak link and break it. So it varies very much. But you can get, I would say, we'll get cable break a week on average, something like that. Anybody got any other thoughts on that? It's about right.
Downwind landing?
Downwind landing, yes. So we do occasionally get downwind landings, but not from a cable break. Not from a cable break. So again, it's part of this fear of landing off the airfield. So you do what we call a reciprocal landing, which is going opposite to the normal runway direction. We do have 1 or 2 pilots who like to get close to the launch bus so they can just turn the glider around and launch again. But that's very rare, and that requires a huge accuracy and skill and judgment, because you're going at some speed. And at some point, if there's a bit of a breeze, you're going to lose aileron authority. So you're still traveling across the ground, and actually your wing might touch down and you might end up ground looping. So, it's not something that is done very often, but it does happen occasionally.
There's also training for cable breaks, so you get both happen sort of more frequently.
That's right. Yeah.
When you say dropping metalwork, is it like a tiny aluminium pin or?
No, it's there are two rings and then a shackle which attaches on two other big rings, then onto that's the brake, and then it goes onto a strop which goes to a parachute, which goes to the dyneema. So it tends to break between all of the rings and the parachute, but you do end up with about this much of rings and metalwork and other bits and pieces. So it is substantial, and there's a strop, a big red or blue or orange. So we have a different strop to attach to the glider depending on the strength of the weak link. So if it's a single seater, it'll be a blue one. If it's a double seater, it'll be a yellow or a red one. And that's the bit you can see, but it is attached to metalwork at both ends. So it's not something you'd want to be.
It could do a massive amount of damage if you're in contact with it.
Yes, and the metalwork is often embedded in the ground, isn't it? And
Yeah.
you go collect it.
Mike, there was one point. Mike, you mentioned that now we're not on wire and we're on the dyneema. You can't see the cables. It's perhaps worth mentioning that we've got very big chutes, drogue chutes, to control the cable coming down, and they are actually quite big and perhaps visible from
You can see
the winch. If we're in front of the winch, because they've been used, they've been towed back in, and they're about 3 feet long, sort of maroon red. So you'll probably see those if you're over the winch sort of area, or you've got it in front of you. They're quite visible.
So it's the indicator is the other way. Rather than looking for the cable being out and ready to launch, you can see that the cable hasn't been reset yet because they're
back at the winch. And of course, as Mike says, you've got the flashing lights on both ends. Those are the things to look out for as well.
So I don't know if let me just. So for those of you who haven't seen them, that's the winch. So it's got a 7.4 litre V8 LPG engine in it, so it's quite a beast, but some of the gliders are pretty heavy, and that's what it has to do. And each of the winch has 2 cables with a parachute on the end of it. So the idea is that if you can see the parachutes at this end, then it's going to be a good 5 minutes before they drag them back out to the other end to launch again. And if you've got 2 winches, then you've got 4 parachutes up by the winches. That means that we're not going to be doing any launching in the near future until the tow-out truck has taken those cables up to the other end. Yeah.
The lights are the obvious clue though, yeah?
Yes, that's right. So
Yeah.
on top, in
Just when
fact,
you're launching, yeah?
I think this is a video here. So if we go to,
Do you see the launch point lights on that as well, Mike? It might be worth mentioning.
I think it's too difficult to try and work it out. So this should be flashing. If we can't see it from here. Exactly. I think it's probably broken, but it should, at any time the winch is on, the light should be flashing.
Another clue is that at the launch point bus is there for a very good reason, not just selling snacks and coffees and all the rest of it. At the front, there is a light system, and when we give the take-up slack to take the bow out of the cable on the ground, there is a light that flashes every couple of seconds. When it's got to all out, you will see it flashing like that, and you know the glider's about to come off the ground. So that's another area to look at, not just the flashing lights on the top, but the white light that is in front of the bus, indicating what's going on to the winch driver.
There is a beacon on the bus as well, so on top of the bus.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's often possible to see that the glider has its wings level, which is only at the
Yes.
point of launch.
So there are all sorts of clues there if you look for them.
Yeah.
How visible are these lights from the air, from, you know?
It's quite hard. I mean, I've tried to do that. I've tried to go, well, okay, how many cables are there by the winches, and are there any lights on another wings level? And I really want to continue with this thermal, and shall I do it? And it's really hard to work it out. I think that if you're feeling brave, then you can have a go. But my advice would be, if they're operating that way to the north, then just get in your mind areas that you're likely to have conflict, or you're likely to come across people, and be very careful if you go into those areas.
What is the bus different colour?
Is the what?
Or the bus is the bus and the winch different colour?
Yes, so the bus is red and white, and it's a proper bus. You'll see it. It's an old.
It's yellow and red.
No, it's red and white.
White.
Yeah, and the winch is yellow and blue.
You're grounding the winch.
You were there this morning, Chris.
Yeah.
It was a hard night, wasn't it?
Yes.
Right, do you have any comments? Can you talk, does
Yes.
Sailplane talk to the launch point or winch driver?
Yes.
Well, no. So there's a ground radio where the launch point talks to the winchy. There is a radio on the launch point bus, which is the airband radio, the frequency that we use. The winchy can hear but can't transmit that. So there is a kind of, if you like, there's a ground communications where they're telling the launch point is telling the winchy what glider's on next, because that depends the amount of power. And also if anybody sees any potential conflict, anybody can stop the launch. So if you're looking upwind to the north end and you see some gliders, paragliders, hang gliders just behind the launch area, quite often people will stop the launch and they'll say, right, we're not launching until that's cleared. But that's up to the launch marshal, the pilot, and the instructor for the day to make the call, or any other pilot who sees something and they say, actually, that's dangerous. Anybody can stop the launch if they see something that cannot come.
Is that safety coming on? Is it?
It's not. So we've got, if the radios don't go down to 129.975 or anything else. So I actually end up flying with my radio, my hang glider, paraglider radio in my gliding cockpit, so I can hear what's going on. But that's just me, because you end up with all sorts of radios for all sorts of purposes.
How often are your launches compromised by the presence of paragliders?
Very infrequently. I think there's a discomfort amongst some of the people on the ground sometimes at the proximity, because, as I say, the mindset in the gliding club is very safety oriented. So your appetite for risk might not fit in with the appetite for risk of the guys on the ground, and that's often where the if you like, just different views come about. So the guys on the ground will say, that's too close, whereas the guys in the air will be going, that's fine. And that's what today is about, really, is trying to give an understanding of the risk as seen by the gliding teams, and then that allows you to make decisions about the flying that you do.
There are occasions when the launch point will actually radio down to the winch. There are paragliders behind the winch, just to reassure ourselves that they are not so close to the winch that we're going to compromise them if anything goes wrong. Those sort of calls do happen quite frequently during the summer.
Yeah.
So that's in terms of distance perception.
Absolutely.
Being
Are they
better from
behind
the
the
winch
winch?
end.
Are they clear, well behind the winch?
Yeah.
Or are they over the winch?
It's very hard to tell when you're at the launch end
Very much
actually
so.
how far
And
away.
those
people
calls
are.
are quite frequent.
One other question, in terms of landing, is there a kind of like, so you've obviously got launching and landing operations occurring potentially at the same sort of time. So is there any clearance for landing process?
Yeah, so the same thing, there's a radio call. So that landing sequence that you saw, where we're going to the north and then round the north side of the airfield, there's a radio call as you're doing the leg in front of the airfield. And that informs everybody that you are now going to go into circuit. And at that point, the launch marshal knows and won't launch until that glider's landed. Sometimes radios aren't heard, radios don't work, and that's why we have this all eyes out option that says the launch marshal, the winchie, the glider pilot, anybody else can stop a launch if they see conflict. And we have had occasionally glider to glider where a glider's been coming into land and somebody's been about to launch. And either they haven't heard or they haven't made the radio call or somebody just hasn't seen the activity going on. So that's why we do rely very much on, as well as having the comms, anybody can say stop, 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 just to make sure it's as safe as possible.
Gary, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Gary?
I was just going to say, we've recently just changed the control lights to LEDs. We do use a lot of LED strobes now at work for the HGV equipment and stuff. I think we should far more visible. I think we need to get John to have a look to see if we can actually swap strobes for LED version, which will give they're much brighter.
Absolutely, that's something maybe Bob and the safety team can have a look at. If they are more visible for you guys as well.
I think the rotating lights, they have quite a narrow kind of like field that they're actually projecting because they're parabolic reflectors.
Right.
And that means that if you're a little bit above the level, you really can't see them at all. So that would potentially be quite a good improvement because LED strobes are radiating basically. So
we can probably maybe position them so that they're actually pointing at least double set them, so we've got them down and going up. There's the pennies in vertical turning within safety, so there's no reason why we can't look at that.
Good plan. Excellent.
Look to selves.
Yes, exactly.
And this is why it's so valuable to have this chat. Anything we can learn.
Sorry, just quickly, with all this talk of comms, is it not worth you guys just having a radio that you can call us on and access our frequencies in your launch caravan?
So we actually have one. We have.
Right.
We have. I think it's just old and knackered and done.
Right. Okay.
So I think that's a very good idea. I think we'll add that to the list of things that we need to upgrade. Because we have them in the winches and in the launch bus. But for some reason they're just old.
Yeah.
So
for the most part, most of us fly with them, mostly anyway.
Yeah.
I just think in those situations where you've got that potential conflict, just go and pick up the radio and say, "Are you aware you're
It isn't so much about us that we stop because of your safety, and that's not to be cocky. But if we launched a glider. The glider probably wouldn't even notice it on the cable. There'd probably be a bit of a bump, and the glider would continue to fly. Yeah.
I need to be like cheese.
But the answer being that we don't launch because we're scared for paraglider safety. That's the main thing.
Yeah. But likewise, I think the conflicting paraglider pilot might be oblivious potentially. They might not realise they're in your way. It's just simple. You realise
and it's that
they might.
perspective. A lot of times we don't launch because we can't tell.
Yeah.
And if we can ask,
and that was the theory. And that was the theory why they put them in the winches because the winch often is at that close end. So I think if we need to put that down the list because actually that's a relatively cheap mod. Make sure we got
winch driver is looking that way, and it may be that we just transmit on 143.952 meter. If any paraglider is in conflict with them, we're about to launch. And if they're on that frequency, we'll pick that up.
Because actually the number of days where we do fly together isn't that high. That's the thing that if you actually look at the number of days, it's not that high. But as Mike's going to talk about, Bradwell is such a well-known site that on the days when it happens, you end up with a lot going on in both operations. So, all right, I'm going to pause there. Let's have a drink and a cup of tea or whatever.
So Actually, there's one thing that I thought it should be worth mentioning from previously, which is that when you were talking about heights,
yes,
particularly in relation to circuit heights, they're all QFE.
Yes.
So they're all relative to the airfield height, because that's what sailplanes are most concerned about. How high am I relative to the airfield? Yeah. So that means the 400 to 800 is 1600 to 2000 feet kind of thing.
Yes.
Final entry heights.
Correct. Yeah.
So thanks very much, Mike. That was really, really good to get a good understanding about, you know, the way in which you fly, the operational stuff and all that kind of thing. What I'm going to talk about is maybe a little bit less along those kind of flavour lines, because we don't really have a lot of kind of like operational behaviours in the same way that you do in a formal airfield kind of like situation. Free flying is a bit more organic, and it's much more related to the kind of performance and the particulars of the aircraft kind of thing. So the first thing to really talk about is how kind of like limited our performance is, particularly on paragliders, slightly less so on hang gliders, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two later. Our stall speed, you know, we're talking about 24 kilometers an hour, 40 kilometers an hour trim, max speed 60. And our minimum sink is not that much worse than yours at a metre a second. And our glide is very limited, around about 10 to 1.
Your dreams.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Yeah. Get yourself on a better ship. If we, oh yeah, that might be more appropriate. It's kind of like versions of numbers for sailplane pilots kind of thing to think about. So 13 knots is quite slow, and 20 knots that we're flying around at normally until we really put our feet on the accelerator and go up to 32 knots. That's, you know, this is very, very slow, relatively speaking, in comparison to you guys. Around about a third of the speed, basically.
Yeah.
And that has obvious implications for where, if you're flying, you're going to expect to see us. You're not going to expect to see us appearing from behind. Certainly not even from the right side or the left side. We're going to be in front of you, basically. That is the big takeaway. So that's a major consideration in terms of where you should be expecting to see us and where you should be concerned about us, basically. That area immediately in front.
Sorry.
Paragliders are quite different to other aircraft. We've got an extraordinary amount of pendulum stability. We're actually more like a helicopter in terms of handling than almost anything else. We don't have any pitch authority. We can't dive, really. We can't pitch up either, or at least not in a particularly controllable way. We've got very good control authority in terms of roll, though. And that roll control gives us a lot of manoeuvrability in the turn. We have a very, very limited speed range, as I've said already. And because of all of that stuff that's hanging out in the airflow, the pilot, the lines, everything else, once we do employ the limited amount of kind of capability that we have to speed up, our glide degrades really badly, kind of thing. So it's difficult for us to make progress at high speed. So that has those performance limitations have an impact on where we're likely to be flying. We can be under certain conditions, we can be quite noticeably tied to the immediate area of ridge lift around takeoff. And pilots who have lower experience or on lower performing gliders can be particularly tied to that area. So that has some implications for kind of like, you know, overcrowding, safety that we have to deal with in terms of the number of pilots in the air when we have conditions coming on and then switching off. You can go from it being quite comfortable to suddenly a load of people basically in a very small area. Progress upwind away from the ridge from a fixed area of ridge lift is quite difficult for us. And there's an old kind of like idea that if you're flying a paraglider or a hang glider, something with limited performance, that we don't like to move out of lift, never leave lift. That's the principle that we use pretty much to go cross country, is that we're essentially trying to stay in lift all the time, which is not that easy. So that kind of like limitation of our performance kind of controls where we're able to fly and where we can get to quite a lot. In terms of safety, we're limited by our speed a lot. Above 18 knots surface wind, it's not really very safe for paragliders at all. I mean, there are some smaller gliders that are designed for flying in stronger conditions, but because they're then flying close to the surface in strong winds, you've got more turbulence, so there's a bit of a balance there. Generally, once it gets to 20 knots, we're kind of like, no, you can't really expect us to be flying. Launching and landing become dangerous. And then the other thing that you may not appreciate is that in significant turbulence, so in higher winds, as I've said, but when there's wave or rotor turbulence about, or in thermal turbulence, paragliders actually become quite difficult to manage. The pilot needs to be concentrating and provide a lot of corrective input to basically ensure that the glider flies properly, stays open, goes where you want it to. So one thing to note there is the final one of these, in thermal turbulence, that is a consideration. Pilots are actively managing their gliders basically, particularly on what you would see as a very good day. And we'll talk a little bit more about that active management later. There are obviously some, the paraglider is the most convenient form of aviation ever invented. It's very easy to learn, extraordinarily so. You've got wonderful all-round visibility when you're flying. You can land in a very small area, so we don't have the same concern about if we go down, we can land in a small field at the bottom. It's no problem kind of thing. And finally, because you've got an aircraft that fits in a rucksack, you can walk to launch with it, you can take it on a train, pop it in the boot of your car, etc. That makes them very flexible. And that flexibility has some implications which Mike hinted at earlier, which we'll talk about a little bit. So I talked about managing the glider in turbulence. There are a few things that can happen in turbulence, departures from normal flight. Something that doesn't happen really on a hang glider, doesn't happen on a sailplane in the same way. So that's interesting. We also, because of our limited speed range and the fact that we can't pitch down, sometimes we find being in lift to be uncomfortable. And we might want to get away from lift. So, and that isn't as easy as it necessarily is on something where you can just put the nose down and fly away at 120 kilometers an hour. So that's of concern. And I've already touched on the idea that we sometimes end up with significant overcrowding in the area that we're flying, because pilots make their own organic decisions about when they take off. As the conditions change, you can suddenly find that we've gone from a situation where there's plenty of room for everyone to there's really not a lot of room. So overcrowding is another kind of like concern for us. So departures from normal flight. In turbulence, a paraglider will normally fly fine and just be slightly perturbed, a little bit of jostling, just as you would feel in a sailplane kind of thing. But if the turbulence is significant and the pilot's attempts to manage the glider are ineffective or non-existent, then you can get a scenario where a full or a partial collapse of the wing can occur, of the canopy. These normally recover spontaneously, but under certain circumstances may require assistance from the pilot, basically. So the pilot has to put the right control input in. And when the wing collapses, depending upon the type of collapse, you end up with a number of different possibilities in terms of what happens. So when you have a loss of control and a collapse, the paraglider may change course unexpectedly and significantly. So in a thermal, it's not unusual for a pilot to be turning in one direction, to suffer a collapse, and then have a complete reversal of their turn direction almost instantaneously. You can also have a situation where the collapse occurs and results in the loss of a large amount of height. Those two things can actually happen at the same time as well. And you can have a situation where essentially the paraglider is flying along and it loses all forward speed basically and just starts plummeting out of the sky in a slightly random fashion.
You're not selling it to me, Mike.
So this is why active management of the glider and flying within the limits of your capability in terms of the turbulence are very important kind of thing. So that's departures from normal flight. Descent stroke escaping lift. So because we've got this limitation in terms of pitch authority and a very limited speed range, we have difficulty escaping large areas of lift or strong lift kind of thing. And typically the place where this is most of concern is when we get close to cloud base. So if we're climbing up towards cloud base and the lift strengthens, we obviously don't want to go into cloud. Well, most of us don't. And to avoid entering cloud, this often means that the pilot actually has to arrange to leave the lift quite early. In the event that the pilot makes a mistake and hasn't planned and left early enough, then there are a number of kind of descent techniques that a paraglider may employ. And those, if you saw them for the first time, if you are thermaling with a paraglider and you see them start to do one of these things, this might not be something that you expect as a sailplane. So let's talk a little bit about that. The two common descent techniques that are used are entering a spiral dive, which obviously you know what a spiral dive is if you're a sailplane pilot. It's quite an extreme maneuver. It's a very extreme maneuver on a paraglider as well. You get a rapid loss of height. It's a high G scenario for the pilot on a paraglider. They're pulling 2 or 3 times normal gravity. And exiting a spiral dive in a controlled fashion is also non-trivial, really. You can't necessarily guarantee what direction you're going to exit in. There may be a large climb that comes after the exit of the spiral dive if it's poorly controlled. So spiral dive is, it results in a big descent rate, a rapid height loss, but it's a high stress, interesting maneuver. And the other maneuver that tends to happen, that people tend to use, is to partially collapse the canopy at the wingtips, and you're probably more likely to see this actually in the kind of conditions that you would see around the airfield here. So the pilot is able to pull some lines. and that causes the tips of the canopy to collapse. It's known as big ears. You get a slower descent rate than you do in a spiral dive, but the glider is still making progress forwards in one direction. The pilot has reduced directional control in that situation. So the glider will pretty much fly straight, but it's a bit more difficult for the pilot to control it in terms of turning left and right. So those are kind of like the things that you might see if a paraglider is trying to get away from lift. This is flying away from lift. This is basically descending enough that you can then fly away in clear air, kind of thing. So obviously we have this situation that, we've got the operational considerations of the airfield and the patterns that you're flying as sailplane pilots. We also have kind of this thing about, in clear air, in the areas around ridges in the Peak District where we're flying together, and we have mixed traffic, sailplanes and paragliders or hang gliders kind of thing. And the typical days where that's likely to happen are mixed ridge lift and thermal flying days for us. So we're starting off in ridge lift, and then we're trying to move into thermal lift to enable us to have a more interesting flight, to possibly go cross country, etc. 10 to 15 knots surface wind kind of thing is quite typical. That's a good kind of like wind strength. A good thermal forecast, high cloud base. And that thing that I said about paragliding being extraordinarily convenient in terms of throwing it in the back of your car, getting on a train, that kind of thing. If you've got a really good forecast, northwesterly, you can have the situation where we have pilots arriving at Bradwell Edge from 8:30 in the morning from all across the UK almost. So that puts a lot of pressure on the kind of like the flying environment. Thanks, Rasp. Thanks, Weather Jack. I mean, it's great for us because we can say, yeah, look, it's going to be a brilliant day and maybe I can fly to Skegness, but it means there can be a lot of pilots arriving, and they're not all DSC members, unfortunately. They don't all necessarily know fully about the kind of interoperation that we're talking about here. So hopefully if this stuff goes online, then, we can make sure that more people understand about the interoperability concerns that we have here. A large number of pilots. Yeah, I'm trying to think.
How many? Yeah.
I think that on a really good forecast day, you could have 100 pilots arrive.
Yeah. Probably not. Day,
yeah.
Probably not all of there at the same time.
No,
because on an XC day, people will be going up and disappearing. But yeah,
absolutely. Because most people who are travelling in because it's a good XC day, they'll have left the hill by 9:30.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk a little bit about getting away. Yes.
If the sailplane pilots are very used to a structured, organised approach to things, it's very worth emphasising how little control we as a DSC have over communication to the influx of
the wider pilot community. Yeah.
I think it'd be realistic to assume that there'll be a lot of people there that haven't a clue about any of this stuff, and they've got no local buy-in to sort of maintain relationships.
I think people who come to Bradwell on a regular basis and come to the Peak District on a regular basis for cross-country flying, a lot of them will have some connection with the club, and we are, we do try and do outreach stuff basically to make sure that people understand and that the resources are available. And we've put signs up and things like that before, emphasising the circuit patterns and that kind of thing, and the areas to avoid. So yeah, it's not a question of, you know, the people who come here who aren't Derbyshire Soaring Club members know nothing, guaranteed, but there may be some who are less educated than we would like, kind of thing. So, of these hordes, the XC League flash mob that have all come to fly to Skegness and land on their goal and gain 250 Tesco points or whatever, they've got a very specific focus, these pilots. They want to complete a thermal climb from the ridge to give them an altitude that allows them to connect to cloud base, basically. They want to be high enough to have a reasonable chance of leaving the immediate area of Bradwell Edge and connect with further climbs. And if possible, they want to do this early in the thermal day, you know, by 11 o'clock. On a really good day, the hot shots will all want to be in a gaggle leaving. And preferably they'd like to do it with half a dozen, maybe a dozen other pilots, kind of thing, because, you know, if they want to fly a long way, it's a lot easier to fly a long way if you've got your friends with you. So that's the people who arrive and who are super focused and on a really good day. Many of them will have this particular mindset, kind of thing. So but that idea of getting away is actually a positive safety thing, because you can't have 100 paragliders flying here all day. Even if it's a really good day, 100 is still too many for everyone to be in the air at once. So large numbers of people getting away reduces the traffic density, and it leaves a lot more room for lower experience and lower airtime pilots of all disciplines who aren't making XC flights. So, you know, if half of the people have left by 1 o'clock, then that leaves more space for training operations. It leaves more space for the lower airtime pilots, etc. So,
Mike, just add to that, the training organisations instruct their students not to fly over the Bradwell Ridge at all, unless they've been briefed and more experienced. Just to give you that one, you haven't got students over here. You've normally got post students who may come over, not students.
Actually, while Mark is mentioning that, what exactly is your training regime? Do you have a structure that you train to?
Well, within the club, the BHP structure, the clubs don't actually do training. You have organisations like Marks and like one or two others that train students from nothing up to
within the BHPA.
Up to within the BHPA that's called BHPA Club Pilot.
Yes, so there is a syllabus to work to.
Yeah, there's a syllabus to work to, club pilot rating, and you have to have a club pilot rating to fly to become a member of DS. You have to have a club pilot rating, be a member of BHPA to join Derbyshire Soaring Club and fly the sites. You're only allowed to fly under the supervision of an instructor like Mark, unless you've got that club pilot rating.
Is there scope, though, for people to ignore that and just hurl themselves on?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And that's the worry for all of us.
Right, that's probably a bigger worry for us than you, because they're unlikely to get high enough to worry.
Whereas they will worry us. Yeah. If they're there, we're up close and personal with them, kind of thing.
It might be worth mentioning that most training on Bradwell Edge will only occur late in the evening when they get into car.
Yeah. First thing in the morning, generally.
First thing in the morning or late in the evening.
Yeah, after you've finished operations or before you start them.
And those are the tandem flights we've seen Mark do.
Yeah, well done, and solo soaring flights as well.
Like your flights, I'm in control, so I'm the instructor in the back.
Right.
So the tandem is the same. Right, instructors in the back.
But most training is not done on. It'd be wrong to think that training is done on tandems, is it? Because it isn't.
More tuition and dissemination.
Yeah. But we start with a small hill and then you move to a bigger hill gradually. So this is a moderate sized hill. So people have had a reasonable amount of experience before they're soaring here. They might do top to bottom flights here reasonably early in the process. The other thing that's worth mentioning in that kind of like sphere is the fact that people who are club pilots, they're not permitted really to go cross country. So much like your kind of ticket system, you have to be pilot rated before you're expected to be able to like leave the hill kind of thing. So club pilots will tend to fly all day here in the vicinity. So yeah, getting away is a good thing from our point of view. Now I put in a little slide here about hang gliders in terms of the difference, because I've been talking mostly about paragliders. And hang gliders generally will be in lower numbers. They may be flying on some days, particularly with higher wind speeds. They've got more performance than paragliders. They have a greater speed range. They've got proper pitch control. They don't have quite such good all-round visibility as we do, particularly above, behind the backs of the ears, and to the rear kind of thing. There's stuff in the way and people are kind of like looking downwards largely. The thing that I would say is that I know as a paraglider pilot that the visual profile of a hang glider is vastly different to that of a paraglider. And it is really, really easy to say the traffic that I'm dealing with today is paragliders, and not to recognise the fact that you've got the odd hang glider mixed in to that mixed traffic scenario. Really, really be aware of that. It's a very, very easy thing to forget that you've got this other third kind of aircraft that's in the sky that that doesn't look the same as the others and has a very, very different kind of way of recognising it and recognising what it's doing.
A very low profile, Mike. Very
very. Compared to a paraglider, the visual profile of a hang glider is very slighter, particularly when it's flying directly towards you or away from you.
Especially if it's just up on the horizon.
Yeah.
So presumably a higher speed.
Yes.
About 70 knots, Liz, for a high performance hang glider, about 50 to 1 glide angle, thereabouts. So pretty high performance, relatively.
However, you know, in terms of volumes in the club and the amount of people out flying, it's kind of like, 10 to 1, 20 to 1 kind of thing ratio. So they're rare, but you should be aware that they can be there, and they're difficult to spot in comparison to a paraglider.
Mike, it might be more like flying when the sailplanes at the same sort of wind strength as the sailplane would fly.
Yeah. There's a little bit more likelihood to, when you're starting to move into the wave conditions kind of thing, hang gliders are a little bit more likely.
25 knots normally is the upper limit, somewhere around 25 knots.
Yeah. So Mike already talked a little bit about this, about kind of like, thermaling patterns kind of thing, and I just thought it was worthwhile to kind of try and sort of look at the ways in which we kind of like operate in thermals in mixed traffic, because it's thermic days that are the busy days. That's when lots of people come here. It's when lots of people are going to be filling the air that we're sharing up. So I think the sailplane numbers were taken from a pooch, roughly. So that's kind of like the vague kind of like performances alongside each other kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good approximation. Yeah.
And then I think Mike's numbers were a little bit smaller than this. But our diameters are generally smaller, really. But if you have a good thermal to yourself, then you'll come down closer to those diameters, I think you would say. And our orbit times are a little bit quicker, perhaps, but not a great deal in it, kind of thing. So that has some kind of like, okay, well, hopefully what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about thermaling patterns kind of thing in mixed traffic in a second, because I've got some slides to look at that. Yeah, so paragliders find it really, really nice to fly in gaggles. I mean, this is a bit exceptional. This is the competition in Colombia kind of thing, with a whole load of world's level pilots. But you can get a situation where there's a gaggle at Bradwell Edge on a good day with 15 gliders in it. It's not unusual. So that kind of pattern, that's an extreme example, but the fact that you can get that kind of pattern, I think, you get gaggles of sailplanes, but it's unusual for there to be more than 4 or 5 in an ordinary club environment, I would have thought, isn't it? Yeah.
Very pretty.
Yeah. I assure you it doesn't necessarily feel pretty when you're in it, especially not when there's about a minute to go to the start. I avoided the 747 and drew my own one. I don't know if it's actually any better, but sorry? It's a training glider, let's say. This is kind of, the idea of this is to make it sort of like interactive so we can all have a bit of a chat about what works and what doesn't work. So if you look at this pattern where a sailplane and a paraglider are trying to thermal at the same radius kind of thing, what's going to be good, what's going to be bad, what's going to be interesting, any
speed difference?
Yeah, the speed differences, I think you would say there's going to be some overtaking going on. Possibly some radical avoidance maneuvers in this kind of like approach. So that's not really a goer, is it?
Does it help, or is it a myth to wave at the paragliders say, "Hey, I've seen you"? Or are you so busy doing other things you don't?
Is that actually a thing? Because
I think some of us tend to do that. If you've got somebody hey,
on cross country, if I'm down between Nottingham and Peterborough or whatever, and I go into a thermal with a glider, I love it when they wave.
Yeah.
We are waving.
Yes.
So that does help.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we're flying, a lot of us flying in close proximity, it's a really, really nice thing to see that somebody has seen you. And there are kind of 2 kinds of pilots. Well, actually, maybe there are 3. There's the one that doesn't see you, but there are people who see you and you can recognise that they've seen you because they move their head. Yeah, so they turn their head to look at you, and that indicates that they've seen you. And then the other kind of pilot has swivelly eyes, and I hate those ones because you can't tell whether they're the first kind that I mentioned that hasn't seen you, or they have seen you but they just don't like to use their neck muscles.
Right.
So waving is good. We don't tend to do it because we're hanging onto the strings.
You do kick your legs.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, sometimes people kick their legs, don't they?
Kick their legs.
You can't really see if they're kicking their legs in a pod now.
No, you have to lift it out the top.
Yeah. So I think we've all kind of like decided that probably doesn't work too well. And in opposition, then this is probably the pattern that does work rather better. And yeah, if we're climbing up the middle and we're seeing a nice wave from the same sailplane pilot going around the opposite side, then that's great. And if you have the situation where you're able to basically match your turn diameter and your turn rate so that you end up on opposite sides of the thermal, that's even better, because if this paraglider encounters a bit of unmanageable turbulence, or is so surprised that you wave that they lose concentration, then they could have one of those departures from normal flight thing, because they're in a thermal, so there is turbulence about. by definition. And in that way, the kind of like overtaking thing at close quarters or going under people and those sort of things are they're not such a good idea because of that possibility of departure from normal flight kind of thing.
What is confusing is when you're in that situation, is when the paraglider reverses a turn.
Yeah, and generally, if you're in a thermal,
you're in the core.
Yeah, we
actually turn to all sorts.
Yeah, we would generally, most experienced pilots would not want to reverse the turn once we've established a turn pattern. However,
if I was with a Sailplane or any other glider, I'd say bad airmanship.
Yeah, to reverse the turn is a bad idea.
Or if you've got a problem and you if you see a paraglider reversing the turn, is it right to say, okay, this guy may have a problem, so let's just leave him alone, or could it just be?
He may well not have reversed the turn. He may well have had a.
You may have had a departure from normal flight. Yeah.
Yeah,
the typical. Yeah, I mean, if you do get a collapse in a thermal, the typical pattern that happens is the outside of your wing collapses, and if it's quite a big collapse, that will normally result in your turn direction either straightening up or going the other way, kind of thing.
Right.
At Bradwell, if we've got Ridgely rather than thermal, we might, when you're coming in from from the straight approach that was shown, you might see us change direction then to effectively doing S's because we're in Ridgely rather than thermal. So we've come to the edge, we've tried to stay away from dead man's books, we've been told to stay away from it. We reverse, but then the other end we need to reverse to stay on that ridge. And if somebody's coming in, should it run
but that is more the thought.
Yeah, so you do get that below a certain altitude, and particularly if there's quite strong wind in terms of drift, pilots will do figure eights basically to do a mixed kind of like thermal and ridge pattern. But normally that's below your altitude, I would say.
The other reason might be if another paraglider came underneath and was coming up, that person might return, do an opposite direction because of the person below them. And I think most paraglider pilots would regard the sailplane pilot as the more less risk, more experienced pilot. He'd be worried, or she would be worried about the person who's on the paraglider below them. Right. So the sailplane's going in an outside direction. They're looking at the inside pilot coming underneath them that might be coming up. So they might turn direction from there. But not always. Like Mike says, if they're experienced, they should hold their course. But less experienced might get nervous with somebody else climbing up on a paraglider below them who's doing the opposite turn for whatever reason, and then they have to go in the same direction or might choose to go in the same direction. That's the only reason why they should turn direction. It's not normally a thing that.
Yeah, just you mentioned about when you get close to cloud base and wanting an exit strategy. Does being with us stop you from doing things?
Yeah, I've got a thing about that. It can do. Yeah,
that could be dangerous, but I think it's fairly unlikely. But because once we get to cloud base, we'd be saying, we're getting a bit closer. We'd be looking to move to the edge of the cloud or maybe glide off a lot before you are. So it'd be really good for you to be aware that we were thinking that, and maybe either give us room or be aware that that we're on the mind.
It's also interesting to note that we use weight shift and a bit of brake to do our turnings, and sometimes it actually gets spat out of things because the lift can undergo the wing can actually make us change.
Yeah, that does happen sometimes. You can have this if it's a really strong thermal core. You can have the situation where you try and turn into it, and you actually get lifted and thrown out in the other direction. It's only ever happened to me once. It's quite rare if you're flying a relatively agile glider, and most paragliders now are reasonably good in terms of control. Perhaps in the earlier days it might have been a thing that happened a bit more often.
I think, Mike, it's worthwhile pointing out that the thermal etiquette in both sailplanes and paragliders all the same. Yeah. Everybody joins the thermal the same way around. If people above you are going a particular way, people tend to change the direction.
First person who enters the thermal establishes the direction.
All the rules are the same.
Yeah, everything is identical.
It's also worth mentioning, Mike, our hand position is very much like the stick of the sailplane. So when you throw the stick over to the left to get the left wing down, the right wing up, we're doing the same with our hands. So we're pulling our left hand down and our right hand up to compensate for that wing roll. So we haven't really explained about how we steer a paraglider.
Yeah.
People here that may not even know
that's
how
true.
we do it. But that is what we're doing with our hands. We're very busy when we're
So
turning.
you see a hand
with our
down, you know they're
hands
going
up and
Yeah.
down,
same direction as
rolling
we
the
want.
bank.
Yeah.
And so while we're doing, we're quite busy, like while with the stick.
Not waving.
Yes, not waving. We neutralise the control. Once we've established the turn, we neutralise the control a lot less than you do in a sailplane. So once you're established in the bank in a sailplane, you just basically you've gone central again, and you're using a bit of pitch and a bit of rudder, aren't you? Presumably to manage it mostly after that kind of thing. Whereas we because we're so stable in roll, we tend to kind of like put weight shift in. We shift to one side in the harness. We put one side down of the brakes, the inner side, and we tend to hold that, and then we manage things a little bit, mostly with a little bit of control on the outside brake. So that's the kind of the physical pattern that you'll see. I mean, obviously, because we're out there in the airflow, you can look at what paragliders are doing, and you can get physical clues in the way that we can't do from the waving.
Chris says that our thermal patterns are essentially the same now. But one of the rules in our work is that the glider will not fly through a dagger, so thermal gliders. In other words, the thermals have priority. We do have a local rule here, which says that below about-ish, and I say rule, it's stern advice, below about 600 or 700 feet, which is, if all you can do is maintain your 600 or 700 feet or less, everybody gets funneled into a narrower band of aircraft going up down the edge, because that's where the bullet is.
Yeah.
So we're all getting crowded up. So it's no good if somebody, let's say 500 feet, starts thermaling and expects everybody else to go around them, because the guys who are desperately trying to scratch the hill, stay out and think, can I make a little beat? Think I might. If they have to give way and go out into the valley because somebody is resisting in the circle, then they're going to lose that bit of height, and then we've got a problem. So we say that below 600 or 700 feet, which of course is our term, don't do full circles, unless you're the man on the ridge.
Yeah.
Behave like a soaring glider, do S turns, where all your turns are out from the middle, which is one of the soaring ones, you turn out from the
Yeah.
And that way, if you need to break off and carry on in a straight line because somebody else is desperately scratching away, you can do it. You're behaving in the same fashion. So there's a little local rule there, which might be
very much the same for us, but I think our break point's a bit lower maybe than yours. Yeah. So we'll be doing the S turns lower, and then we'll transition. And a lot of the lower experienced guys are traveling up and down the ridge all day, so we're all very aware that if we start turning, even if we get the space, there's low experienced guys who are coming up and down who we're trying to stay out of the way of as well. Because even if it's okay for us, we're probably stressing those guys out when we're reaching.
So there is in fact some commonality.
Yeah. I mean,
our quickest way of getting out of the way is just to get in. If you do a strong turn in as quickly as possible, get up and go. But it'll be a fair air talk, and we'll probably end up losing that turn. We'll be back on the back.
Yeah.
Always a conflict between staying up and not.
Exactly. I mean, the general rule that experienced pilots tend to use is that it is okay to establish a thermal pattern if you're not going to impinge anyone who's ridge soaring. So you wouldn't kind of like, if there are people who are ridge soaring and you're low enough that that you're going to cause them trouble, then in that situation you would S until you were high enough or you had enough space or whatever that you could then start to establish the pattern. So it's very similar. There isn't a formal rule, but we try to ensure that we don't disrupt people who are ridge soaring when we're thermaling kind of thing.
Sounds exactly the same.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is once you're qualified, there's no CFI watching you. So once these pilots that have come out of school are qualified, there is club coaches in the paragliding club and club coaches for hang gliding as well. But once you've qualified, there's no CFI or senior instructor specifically overseeing what you do once you've got your club pilot rating.
Where do I sign?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's good. That's triggered a little discussion. So this is
Doing a loop.
No, he's doing what I would describe as an eccentric orbit. Yes. So the paraglider is in the core here, and the sailplane is kind of like coming in and taking bites out of it.
The core.
Yeah, well, possibly the paraglider. Nearly. So, yeah, this I think is probably, this is as bad as the first one kind of thing. But actually for the sailplane pilot, it's probably worse for everyone. Because the way that I would see it is that the paraglider is going to be alarmed by the sailplane coming in at high speed, coming into the core area and then leaving again, and then repeating that pattern. There's no synchronization between the two gliders in terms of where the paraglider will be in its orbit when the sailplane comes in, kind of thing. The sailplane's going from a kind of low traffic environment to a very high traffic environment, back out again with each orbit kind of thing. So if you're outside, I think the advice would be to stay outside, kind of thing. That not to keep recentering activity relatively kind of like mild. And the same thing I think applies in the reverse direction for paragliders. So if the sailplanes are orbiting around the outside, paragliders have a tendency to answer and hang gliders to be constantly recentering. They're just doing it all the time. But limiting that activity to stay within the bounds of if there are sailplanes orbiting you, don't push out into the sailplane zone kind of thing. Try and remain within the established pattern. So yeah, that kind of like eccentricity, be predictable in what you're doing if there's mixed traffic. And then I think I then took, it's vertical separation. Yeah, you can see my model is really suffering here. I don't know what it is now. Some kind of like sideways religious symbol or something. So vertical separation, if a sailplane comes in above a paraglider or a paraglider comes in below a sailplane kind of thing, then I think we kind of established that depending on the thermal environment, maybe the paraglider will climb a little bit faster, perhaps, or the hang glider will climb a little bit faster, but not necessarily a lot. So in this situation, perhaps the sailplane can expect that the paraglider might come up to meet it, kind of thing. So the idea of being aware below you is quite important, particularly because, visibility below is not that great, is it? It's okay. It's okay when you're banked up, but it's not as brilliant as it might be, kind of thing.
What we are seeing round here is the high performance sailplanes coming from all sides. They might see somebody thermally on Bradwell come in, dolphin up, pull, convert speed to height, and just clear off. So you just get sailplanes, come from nowhere. Suddenly appears in your thumb.
Come straight through, balloons up.
Yeah. Seen them pass from Limpsfield.
Takes 300 foot and then goes.
Watch one come from Limpsfield. He never turned. He just came on the horizon, passed here, and disappeared towards Barnsley.
That's interesting to know that happens.
Amazing for it. And he got back to Limpsfield.
Well, I would expect so. He'd be disappointed if he hadn't, I would imagine. So yeah, the ideas of paragliders coming up is, but it doesn't happen in all circumstances. So the other way around kind of thing, if the paraglider is above and the sailplane comes in below, that's probably less likely in my book to result in some kind of
I think the challenge with that is coming in is quite often, as Dave says, you do get quite a significant gain of height. You have to be aware as a glider pilot that there might be a paraglider pilot above you, but by the time you've converted your speed from 80 knots down to 45 knots, you might have gained a couple of 100 feet, and you may be in a similar place, similar height to the paraglider. So you therefore need to position yourself when approaching so that when you've done that climb, you're actually on the opposite side of the firmament.
You're going to be synchronized.
Most of the time, this will happen when people are cross country because you see the paraglider pilot for a long way away, and that's like the label lives here, and people are going and they'll wind up. One that you had previous is where we were talking before, which is the classic one. Everybody's on the hill at Bradwell with the paraglider. You see the sailplane out in the valley, getting the lift. That's great. Very much found it, and then you manage just to creep out and just connect with the bottom of it, and then you start flying. The guy who's up above doesn't necessarily look down. The sailplane doesn't look down, and the paraglider, of course, is concentrating on climbing, and he's got a canopy above him. He doesn't see as well. So the visibility is better in this situation for both parties, but you've got that issue of the climb, the convert climb as the entry to the thermal occurs for the sailplane. So that's at the same level, this idea of kind of like being opposite, but and waving if you feel like it. But this is the thing that was touched on a little bit earlier by Ross. I think you kind of like mentioned it. Is if you're at the same level as a paraglider and you're approaching cloud base, at that point we start to get nervous.
I mean, if I got a sailplane outside at that point, I'd be starting to get worried because I'd be like, how am I going to escape this with you whipping around? So at that point,
So the paraglider pilot at this point will start to be thinking about flying straight, potentially flying straight towards the nearest edge of cloud. That's the direction they're most likely to go. If you're in the immediate area of the ridge here, they'll probably fly either directly downwind or directly upwind, would be their preferred leaving direction, depending upon whether they're thinking that they'll wait for some other friends to leave with, or they're not going cross country on the day, or whether they're thinking that they want to go downwind and try and get to Peterborough or wherever. So, and the kind of thing that I talked about earlier about the descent approaches, so the descent techniques, the paraglider may, if they find themselves in a very strong piece of lift, they may tighten their turn and go into a spiral and start dropping down right through the middle, rotating very fast kind of thing, or they may straighten up, collapse their canopy, and then be basically just flying with limited directional control to the nearest edge of the cloud kind of thing.
What height would you think the paraglider go, Mike, just for the sailplane people?
What, that they would leave?
Yeah, roughly. And good cumulus cloud, what height would a sailplane leave to go to the edge or wind of a cloud?
I would say 400 foot.
Yeah, 400-500 foot, guys. That's quite distance compared to a sailplane. You can almost afford to in a sailplane go underneath it. We can't. You've got to go before. So 400 or 500 feet.
They'll certainly start, if it's a good climb,
thinking about going.
they'll certainly be thinking about moving towards the edge of the cloud at that kind of like altitude below base. So
in general, 45 degrees or whatever it is.
yeah.
Ish.
So you've seen
30 degrees. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think what's worth mentioning there as well, and I think you use the word good cumulus. I think the idea of good cumulus, and something I learned as well when I transitioned from sailplane flying to paragliding, what a sailplane pilot might see and look at that cloud and go, oh, that's fine, that's perfectly safe, might be absolutely horrifying for us to be underneath. So that distance can change quite a lot.
The limited capability to run away, and the fact that descent manoeuvres are quite, interesting. Because big ears isn't really a descent manoeuvre. It's just it's a bit like air brakes for yourself. Yeah, you're just degrading the efficiency of your glider a little bit, and you can degrade the efficiency and stick the nose down. We're just degrading the efficiency, so we don't really get that much kind of like decrease or increase in sink rate kind of thing. And you can certainly find that some people are very, very concerned about getting near cloud, depending upon the conditions. I think. Oh yeah, there we go. I should probably click that earlier. Yeah. So at some point he's going to want to go. So be aware of that, and it may be earlier than you think. That's it from me, really. So
can you do some distances that we've done on Paragliders and Hang Gliders?
Distances?
Yeah, XC distances.
Just give an idea. So the UK record, flight to goal, is held by a DSC club member, Richard Carter, and it's 303. I think it's 303 kilometres. It's from the Elan Valley in central Wales all the way to Scarborough.
Good. And how long does that distance take, roughly?
That was an 8-hour flight.
Really?
3
weeks?
Yeah. A good kind of like cross-country speed on a downwind cross-country day is around about 30 kilometres an hour. That's a respectable speed kind of thing.
Do you have in-flight plumbing?
Yes.
Right. So you're not necessarily going to get our wings a little bit grubby. So okay, so
the in-flight plumbing is available.
Right.
Yeah. Closed circuit flights on a paraglider are more difficult. There was what is for the Peak District a very large triangle done last year, 100 kilometre odd triangle in the Peak District. The UK record is not much bigger than that, really. Big triangles in the Alps are much more achievable. I would love to go to the Italian-Austrian border and go and do a 200 kilometre triangle kind of thing. It's on my list of things to try and do.
World record is 5 minutes. Can we do a paraglider?
Yeah, the world record is, and you might be surprised that some things, for example, the longest flight to goal in a competition on paragliders, at one point was set here in the UK a few years ago. A flight down from Scotland, finishing on the north side of Manchester airspace. And so that's good. All of these other places around the world, like Spain and Australia, where they've got extraordinary conditions, people do good things here as well.
What about our latest 600 kilometre flight in Texas, ending Amarillo?
Oh yes, exactly. 600. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yes, it's well over 500 now. So
Sailplane, I didn't realise at all about the danger underneath paragliders, the stability, the loss of stability, and you might descend. So I wouldn't have been flying underneath in that way anyway, but I just did not know that at all. Yeah? As a sailplane, something I would never have considered. So that's what the other thing is that the joke on it, of course, is I've been waving it. Nobody's ever waved back. Now I know what you meant. That's quite nice.
It's if you're on a cross-country flight, it is absolutely lovely to meet up with a sailplane pilot and fly with them in a thermal, and then you both go your separate ways, kind of thing.
They're different paces.
Yeah, very different paces. But,
the analogy that we're sharks hovering around, a herring shoal is dispelled. Anyway, sorry.
A short survey. So, how many of you guys would recognise the two-seaters?
That's interesting.
What was that?
How many would recognise a two-seater as opposed to a single-seater?
Half of you maybe. You really ought to assume that two-seaters have been driven by complete nutters.
It's almost the reverse in paragliding.
Some single-seaters are as well.
Yeah.
Bear in mind that when we're instructing on the sailplane, we're not committed to teach all the time. So we're not a solo guy who's actually enjoying the job, teaching himself another job. So we've got to be there. And right at the beginning of that as a career, right in the front, you can tell how to get to see other scenarios and turn left. I'll turn left, the other left.
Yeah. No, sit back in the middle now.
And they're also hopeless at coming out on the heading, so trying to avoid something is really difficult. Okay, so the teaching is going to be such that you're reasonably confident, or reasonably happy that they're going to be fairly safe mixed up with other traffic. Then when you get towards the time when you're teaching into landing fields and just pre-solo, you then have to put them in a position where they wouldn't normally expect to be. So you completely fuck it up for him and say, right, which means that the two-seater once again will behave like a complete numpty because he is not following the pattern that you would expect. We're putting somewhere where it's really difficult for him. So be aware of the fact that the two-seaters around here will be flying and actually have a job to do, and at times will be thoroughly unpredictable as well. It's the same goes for our sailor pilots. It's a nice set of words to use.
Yeah. The only is by the time that you identify that it's a two-seater, we can't do a lot.
You can hightail it.
It might be worth mentioning that we tie red ribbons on they probably be nowhere near you. But if they are, and he's got a red ribbon.
As well.
The
shape of the wing as well. It's a long thing. It's a long thin wing. It's very experienced.
We're talking about
high aspect ratio.
Very short, fat murmur. Quite likely is a very inexperienced pilot.
I think Mike also at some point said that the experienced pilots are much more laid back, whereas the less experienced are sort of sitting there hunched and sitting up more upright. So that's the way we can find them.
And the other
trailing out.
Sometimes I'm trailing out.
The bigger the arm, the higher
red.
So the arm aspect ratio isn't spread about by the span, it's the arc, because it's a paraglider. So the bigger the arc, usually, the higher performance the wing, normally, the more experienced the pilot. So the less of arc, so the less of the arc, the less experienced the pilot necessarily will be.
Yeah.
Narrow from front to back is very wide.
Probably looks like a pigeon or a swan.
And a swan.
I was going to say, this is a general rule, okay? A general rule. What I would say, into that recognising what's two-seater, what's less experience. Because of the age of gliders and Paragliders, generally it's got a cruciform tail. So like our single-seaters, yeah? Our mooches, they've got a cruciform tail. So it would indicate it's probably a less experienced or a training aircraft. But a T-tail, private aircraft, okay, in our club now. So that should be an indication.
And if you've got sexy wingtips.
Oh, yeah.
Don't make it complex. That's like does every sailplane part agree that's summary? Yeah,
but it's got sexy wingtips. It's really scary.
It's really scary. Keep away from the wingtips.
The guy who's saying other lift is going to be standing on the hill.